committee. Thank you for your talk, and this is in relation to WESTCONNEX. I'll keep it brief. Okay, do you agree with the proposition that WESTCONNEX was never about future-proofing Sydney's transport and reducing the travel times for people driving from Sydney's west, but rather is a giant, soon-to-be privatised tollway scam, the mother of all tollway scams, designed to transfer millions of dollars for years to come from the public to a handful of the Liberal government's corporate mates? And what can the anti-WestConnex campaign learn tactically from the successful campaigns against the Row 8 Perth Freight Link highway extension and the defeat of Melbourne's East-West link? And finally, do you think the New South Wales government's obsession with roads and the car and refusal to consider a radically improved mass transit public transport system that could be built for a fraction of the $17 billion official cost of WestConnex is connected to a conservative right-wing bias against public transport in favour of the private motor vehicle, along the lines of Tony Abbott's assertion in his book Battle Lines that the private car embodies the spirit of free public enterprise, every motorist being a king in his own car, whereas collectivist public transport is tantamount to socialism?
What a great question. Yes, I agree with that. I do agree. On the thing about Row 8 and the East-West, the circumstances are somewhat different. I agree with the direct action tactics used in those situations, but the fact is it was a lot more localised. The really big challenge with WestConnex is how huge it is and how many sites of construction we're tackling all at the one time. And we'd also, I think, unfortunately, the Victorian Labor Party is a bit of a different beast than the New South Wales Labor Party, which is worse. But I think, yeah, your question's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, Brian Concannon. First thing I'd just like to say, toll roads suck. Now, if I'm sorry, but okay. If Australia was lucky enough to have another great leader like Gough Whitlam, and he decided to nationalise our education, health and banks, and he decided to abolish toll roads. Do you think that would be possible? How would you go about that? Would we have to pay them out for that whole 43-year profit cycle of burden? Or how would you go about it? And my second question is about the planning laws, which I'm passionate about, because I was at the protests for the FIGs, Anzac Parade, a few times. Almost got arrested one night, came very close. But I believe Lucy Turnbull, Malcolm's wife, has got a very high position on the Planning Management Committee. Has she got a conflict of interest there? I believe she has. What are your views on that? And the other question?
Well, I guess in relation to the first question about whether we're going to have another time like 1972, I guess it's never out of the question. You know, the new generation comes along, is very aware of all the evil things that have been done in previous decades. So I wouldn't discount the fact that despite all the claimed apathy that people might say infects generations, particularly the younger ones, I don't really find evidence of that. I think there are a lot of very young people coming up through the environment movement and the various political movements. So there's some hope there. Would they have to pay out the contract? Well, most probably. One of the things these governments have learnt is how to create ironclad contracts, not only because they want to be nice to their mates, but because that's what the bankers want. They want a certainty for their investments. So I would imagine it would be extremely difficult to nationalise and bring back into public hands those tollways with those contracts. unless those tollways went bankrupt because they got the traffic projections wrong, which is what happened with the Lane Cove Tunnel. Yes, that's right. In regard to the second question about the planning system, there is no doubt under the current government and to some extent the latter stages of the Labor government, both Carr and... who followed Carr? Yema, yeah. He wasn't there very long, was he? The corporatisation of the regulatory system certainly continued apace. And I do think whoever is the next government, that they can start creating a much more effective public sector that actually responds to public needs, not the telegraphed needs to the party in power from the development lobby. As much as I think some of the policies of the ALP are a great improvement on the current government, I can tell you that, and this is where one understands the need for very strong and effective community campaigns, it doesn't matter if there's a Liberal Premier or a Labor Premier. The CEOs of business get in to see them. We might get to see them once a year. So we are fighting that level of access all the time, and therefore we have to invest more and more in community participation and giving people the skills about how to create a lot of political trouble for the government at the time.
Hello. My question is to you. What do you think is needed to push more of a nationalisation of the transport and movement away from the corporations?
Well, I think to some extent Jeff has kind of answered that, and some other people here might have some ideas, but one of the, I think it's a whole bigger problem about rebuilding. I don't actually think the public ever lost faith in the public sector altogether. I think it's the private interests took over and the political resistance wasn't there in government. So I think if we're going to do anything in terms of rebuilding the public in New South Wales, it really is, I really agree with Jeff, it's got to come from the community and people and rebuilding that, and with those political allies that we can, you know, I mean, not everyone here will be a supporter of the Greens. I am a supporter of the Greens because what I see in Newtown is Jenny Leong supporting the community. She's there with the community, she can deal with Parliament. Now that doesn't mean everybody needs to be a Green, but it means we do, if we are going to have political alliances, they've got to be with people who will support us, political movements that will support the community, not actually just sell them out.
I'd like to briefly bring up two areas. The first one is about demographic changes, whereas the car, sort of, it's always been a very strong part of the culture in Australia, in common with other similar cultural background countries like the US and so on. But in recent times, actually, this seems to be changing. Elizabeth Farrelly, among other commentators, have pointed out how that because of social media and things like that, that's one reason why people don't want to be sitting in cars. Obviously, it's much easier to get onto the social media if you're travelling in public transport. So I guess that sort of affects the whole sort of viability of the future of building these roads, and raising the question, you know, for whose benefit is this if we are having these cultural changes, less interest in the car and so on. And a lot of the younger people also want to live closer to the city where there'd be far less need to have a car anyway. So if I could, yeah, we could have some comments about that. And the second thing concerns this, it's been raised already, but a very other nasty aspect of this is this insofar as a lot of these contracts having this stipulation about if governments approve public transport along running in parallel with these tollways and so on, affecting, breach of, the commercial viability or that of the other private operators and so on. I'm just curious about the origin of that, how that came about, whether that's been implemented previously in other countries, and a bit more about the background of that.
Well, in relation to the contracts having you can't build public transport to compete with the tollway in this corridor, that certainly was the case with the M2. Yeah, and that certainly came under very severe criticism from the auditor. I'm not sure if that practice has been continued. I got the impression it had been continued, and for, pretty stupid. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. But again, that was about giving certainty to the investors that they get their money back. But that was certainly an extreme example of the private sector interests contaminating what was supposed to be public decisions. Probably it's been done overseas, but I don't have any knowledge of that. On the other hand, maybe Australia, in particular Sydney, invented the more extreme example of how you do it. In relation to the car, the overt reasons they build these roads, of course, is because Sydney has traffic congestion, and it's appalling. I mean, it does create enormous adverse economic impacts and health impacts. But the thing that the planners, particularly Transport New South Wales and their ministers, can't get is that those roads are going to fill up because they're built in the context of a growing city. And the only thing that will actually create a more effective and mass transit system is public transport, because a city can grow into it. But if you encourage more road transport and therefore people using their cars, it's completely self-defeating. I think that it doesn't really matter how many more roads we build in Sydney, they will just always fill up very fast. And one of the more extreme outcomes of that is let the roads fill up and people will start taking public transport. And I think there is clearly a trend in that direction, because public transport is getting more and more patronage, and people just realise,
And more and more crowded.
Yeah, well, yes. I think the Labor government under Carr did bugger all for public transport, and I will give the LNP some credit for actually investing in public transport, despite Tony Abbott's ideological opposition to it.
I think one of the things about them investing in public transport is that unfortunately a lot of it is private transport and not necessarily very well planned. I think a good example of that is the metro that's going to come under the city and somehow 22 buildings have to be knocked down, and is then going to downgrade Erskineville and St Peters, Marrickville stations. So, but the other thing is just getting back to getting cars off the roads. Maybe, Mark, that you're right that there is a drift away from cars, partly because of the expense of them also, and because of, people being able to work by distance, and there could be demographic changes there that will be really significant. But the other thing is, what I've been told is that it would only take 15% of cars off the road, and then we would actually have enough roads for the trucks or whatever that unfortunately, it'd be good if that could be rail. And so what's what I wonder, whatever happened to all those policies about getting people to share cars? Because you go out to the corner of King George's Road and the M5, and I would say 95% of cars in the morning are single occupancy. So if something, like in China, they would do something about that, or maybe they haven't. That's their problem in China, but maybe they will eventually. But I just figure that there should be other social solutions short of just building more roads and creating more traffic congestion.
I'm going to give my name, Richard Cody from unemployedembassy.magics.net. We've been campaigning a long time about housing. This is one from about 1980, decentralised Sydney, to lower rents and stop slums. And obviously Sydney's not sustainable the way it's going. It's got the mountains that can't even spread out further than that. And we can have a new airport in the middle of what's going to be the middle of the city demographically is Liverpool. So there's really a problem that, for instance, I did a placement with the Total Environment Centre, and I had to write an article for the Herald, and I raised the issue of decentralisation, and I was failed on this. It wasn't their policy, but I didn't have anyone to talk to about what the real policy is. And they criticised the article that Jeff signed. People said, well, why don't you talk about population? We've got the highest immigration rate in the world outside Israel, which they've got a particular reason for bringing all their people back. And they're mostly coming to Sydney, right? I might throw in that Jenny Leong I talked to about Devonshire Street and said, they're going to knock down these mature trees. It's like a Parisian cafe strip there. She said, oh, it doesn't matter, they'll grow again. So I don't know where Jenny, sort of, what her thing is. So, well, I'm telling you, she did say this. She thought it should go up Oxford Street. So you can't depend on politicians to be up to date on things. They've really got to come down to the community. I think it was called Push, the Surrey Hills people. They went to court to try and stop it going up Devonshire Street, the tram, right? But, and I disagree with Wendy about the WESTCONNEX. Part of it is they've revealed that want to put it under the harbour and up to Sydney Road and Balgowlah. So that's definitely a freeway to the airport. So I'll just say...
Can you get to a question, please?
Well, the question is... Well, the question is, why have we got a WESTCONNEX going to the airport if they're going to move the airport? Big questions, not just little questions about what's happening to people's houses, that's important. But what's happening to Sydney? Is it going to keep growing like this? Obviously, we're going to keep widening roads and having more roads. Really, we should decentralise, have a very fast train to, say, Canberra and Gosford, so people can shoot in, like in other countries in the world. We just don't have any proper plan for Sydney at all, except to crowd more people in. And Jeff himself was one of the proponents of urban consolidation, which is building more houses in people's backyard. And you can see how good that is, because they all want cars. They don't have backyards anymore, right? So, you know, the people that we're depending on aren't necessarily going to come up with solutions. It's really up to the public to say, look, we want to have a say in this, not some of these peak bodies or the Greens who pretend they know what they're talking about.
I mean, one of the arguments for the Greater Sydney Commission is that, unlike some other cities, Sydney is still going through a very big growth phase. I mean, I guess that's obvious. I'm not sure whether it's justifiable, but... and one of my ongoing preoccupations trying to make society more environmentally sustainable is the issue of transition. That it is physically, politically impossible just to say stop. So that you have to leverage the type of political influence, what people are feeling, in order to push society towards transition. And that's a very, well, not in my view, a necessary thing, but it's a very complicated thing to do, because you are trying to get a range of economic and social and political dynamics pointing in the same direction. Yeah, I'll get to decentralisation. Yeah, we clearly support... that's all right, it's the debate. We clearly support some decentralisation. You may want to go and ask the people in the Illawarra and the Central Coast what they think of that, but you have to negotiate that with them. You have to negotiate... Probably thinks I'm not answering it, but anyway, you have to negotiate that question. But decentralisation has a limit. It may be possible on the coast. Inland, there are not the water supplies to actually support large populations. So let's not try and imagine there's going to be big cities outside of west of the mountains. I'm sorry, I've learnt after 40 years there are no simple stop answers. You have to negotiate, create political pressure to force transitions, and that's a very damn big job for communities to do.
You know, no one can live around here. Even police and nurses can't live around here, right?
I think next
This is part of the question. You can't stick it into a box like that. It's a big question.
Look, Jeff is trying to answer your question. He's actually trying to, and I can understand your anger and frustration about, you know, the $1 million houses and, or, you know, so many bad things you can see happening. But Jeff is actually trying to engage with your question, Richard.
Yeah, I'd like to remind everyone that it's politics in the pub forum and not one-on-one. So my question is, well, it's with regard to the context that, sure, we're expanding. It's my turn now. We're expanding, but we're expanding with a ridiculous situation where there are, for every homeless person, there are 2 unoccupied units, and it's growing. And house prices are increasing, and rents are increasing. Now, my question is in relation to these kinds of projects, which is financed by taxpayers' money, but may actually be making profits for private corporations and people. Could there be real state deals behind WESTCONNEX, for instance? And even if there is a growing interest in public transport, they're privatizing buses. So we have this insidious pattern where they are using public monies to increase profits for private individuals and corporations. How can we fight it? How can we stop it? How can we reverse it?
I don't think I've got any better answers than anyone else in this room to that. I agree with what you're saying. And the sense I get of it is that more and more people are being marginalised and not even given a chance in life at all in this city. You know, young men in their 30s who aren't working because they're so marginalised that they're homeless, could be turned around, but not through just, you know, shelter or staying homeless, you know. And you know, it's a much bigger political question about how do we organise people. I see a huge loss, the loss of union power. You know, the ability of unions to sort of intervene, but you know, we've just gone so far with that, undermining the right to strike. You know, that was a Labor Party thing. You know, but I know everyone in this room is trying to organise and do what they can. So I don't feel probably some of you have got better solutions than I have, but you know, I appreciate what you're saying and I agree with it and share your sort of frustration. Though I don't think you are frustrated. I think you're just saying let's do it, but how?
Thanks very much, Jeff and Wendy. My name's Jim McElroy. I wanted to perhaps talk or just mention the other side of the equation, which to me, while there has been a fall in union power and so on, it seems to me that both speakers have referred to the fact that the people's movement, whatever that is, out there, is rising up again. You know, I don't think that we should necessarily be pessimistic. I think that the campaign, for example, for the green spaces, you mentioned a whole lot of groups have been formed. It's like a revival of perhaps the movement of the 70s that's starting to happen. You know, all the contradictions and all that are there, and the loss of union support is pretty critical if you compare it to the old Green Bands movement. But it seems to me that there are so many local groups being formed, there are so many people's movements being formed, that there is a potential there for uniting the different elements which various people have formed to. I mean, I've been involved to some extent in the Sydney Park campaign, and I wanted to just mention to people that if you want to get involved in the WESTCONNEX, the campaign against WESTCONNEX, please, I'll just mention, Wendy mentioned that there were no feedback sheets from WESTCONNEX. Well, I actually got one last night at the Haberfield Library, and I'm going to put it to good use. If anyone wants to be on the email list for the anti-WESTCONNEX campaign. I'll just be at the door later and you can put your name on there. But, you know, we have got to build this movement. We've got to save Sydney. It's disastrous what's happening with the roads, the destruction of green space. There is the consciousness out there, but I think our big problem is that we have so many different issues and we're all sort of organising in our own little areas, but somehow we've got to unite this movement. And, you know, for example, someone just mentioned that the bus is about to be privatised. Well, there's huge opposition to that out in the western suburbs, and the drivers are mad as hell, and they've had meetings at all the depots, and they want to go on general strike, seriously. And, you know, and so there's enormous feeling out there. Somehow we've got to organise for it. So I just wonder if the panel could comment on that, and perhaps in the more optimistic way that we can fight this, both the destruction of green spaces and WESTCONNEX. We can still stop WESTCONNEX, or we can stop what hasn't been built so far. You know, if we can mobilise these forces. I wonder if you know, the panel could comment on that.
It's certainly true that community campaigns spiral up and down, and spiral the right word? Whatever. Go up and down, and there certainly is a impression of growing momentum. One of the things we are trying to do with the Green Spaces campaign is give various groups training in social media. You know, I'm a somewhat late adherent to social media, given how long I've been around, but it has a role, and those groups need some of the fundamentals to help their communications. I think if you only need to look at what GetUp's doing, you know, frightens the hell out of the Liberals and people like Peter Dutton. So if they can generate such a scary movement for the Conservatives and for developers and for Adani, then clearly there is some hope and some community resources that are being able to be mobilised. Whether that will be sufficient depends a lot on timing. And as I said to someone before, well, from July this year, we're in the run-up to the next state election, and the atmosphere of politics will change. You know, the government will become more sensitive. In fact, I know that. They're already freaked out and talking about it. So we take advantage of that moment in history, and nothing ever happens smoothly, nothing ever happens suddenly, but you do know that you are investing in the community and you are being taken notice of by the political system. There is no doubt. They may appear as if they don't listen to us, and they may appear that they put out a whole bunch of stupid excuses suggesting they don't listen to us. But I know, and I'm sure many of you know, they are watching everything and taking their own political calculations. So, you know, nothing that we do, nothing that we do in terms of community mobilisation and contacting the local MP goes unnoticed, and it actually does build momentum.
I agree with that. I also agree that I think Jim is right that there is a growing movement. I mean, it is always hard to tell because there is some, it is, you know, you can get fairly subjective impression if you haven't, like, if you're suddenly doing it, maybe you weren't doing it before, and you can sort of get, but I think you're right nonetheless. I think there's a preparedness to take action. And I think that, you know, while I think Get Up is a sign that you can exercise power, particularly through social media, the one thing I'm not so keen on about Get Up is that it does not, I think there are in fact a lot of young people, other young and old people who go in there and help it Get Up, but it is a fairly passive kind of idea. You get emails, you can't reply to them, you can just give money. It's just, for me, that is not the politics that I see hope in. I would see more hope in the community action and some sort of serious attempt to pull it together, which is what Jim is talking about. So, yeah, I mean, it's no good being totally demoralised. You might as well keep having a go and try to come up with solutions.
I mean, I do want to say that, I do want to say that, you know, I think the character of Get Up was that sort of, you know, click a petition. But the fact is they are now organising people on the ground. And that's what scares Dutton. There's going to be several hundred young greenies and get-up people out there telling people not to vote for him. So, you know, they are taking some signal from that. So that's very important.
Yeah.
Munro Saunders, a question on public transport. Wendy hinted at this. The best way to make roads faster and more efficient is to improve public transport. Now, there was a study reproduced in the Gold Coast, but it hasn't had very much attention. It's been done in other parts of the world. In the Gold Coast, when they introduced light rail, the roads got faster. It only takes a few percent of motorists to move from driving cars to taking public transport, and the roads actually, for that few percent less traffic, get significantly faster, and the speeds of public transport and roads tend to match when they run in parallel or more or less in parallel. So any comments on that study? Or yeah, probably.
I also think needs more, particularly the emphasis needs to be on more public transport in the western suburbs, because talking to people out there, the problem is if you say live in Erskine Park, I think you go to St Mary's by train, it's not, you know, that's an all stations train, and then I think it could be 26 stops on the bus. So that makes it really hard. It's also really hard for older people out there if they get to feel they can't drive cars and public transport's so bad. More jobs, yeah, so you don't have to travel. But even just to travel into Penrith, you know, is still quite a long way. So I think that whole, you know, axis across the city, and I can see where Clover Moore's plan is coming to, wanting a north-south axis across, why that King George's Road is in there. But actually just for the other half of the city, there needs to be a big northwest public transport system, and I think there is some talk of that. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but I totally think, and that's what young people are saying, mass public transit, people who travel, experience it overseas, they can see the advantages of it, and I think there is a really strong underpinning sort of mood in favour of that we need to just keep pushing. And I think, yeah, I know, I think it's great. I think it's great. Why not? Well, yeah, let's.
Okay, so a round of applause for Wendy and Jeff, and thank you for coming and speaking to us tonight. Next week we have Correcting Colonial Narratives, Australia, Israel and South Africa, with Kathy Peters, from ABC radio journalist and president of the Coalition for Justice and Peace for Palestine, and Paddy Gibson, who is the senior researcher at Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning. So I hope we see you all here again next week, and thank you for coming along, and thank you for staying for question time.